Before we begin, take one quick second. If you want clear, fearless breakdowns of the biggest political stories, hit subscribe, press like, and leave a comment with your thoughts. Your voice matters in this conversation. Tonight's breaking story is one that no one expected to hear. The President of the United States, Donald Trump, has taken a step that is sending shockwaves across North America, in a move that stunned diplomats, economists, and even some members of his own administration. The Trump White House has frozen Canadian bank accounts connected to major financial transactions with the United States. Yes, you heard that correctly. For the first time in modern history, the United States has used financial pressure directly against Canada, one of its closest allies. This is not a small policy disagreement. This is not just another trade dispute. This is a financial strike. And within minutes of the announcement, the response from Ottawa came fast, sharp, and completely unexpected. Canada's Prime Minister, Mark Carney, did not hold back. In fact, insiders say his reaction shocked even his own allies. But to understand why this moment is so explosive, we need to go back to what started all of this. Because behind this sudden move is a growing fight between Washington and Ottawa that has been building quietly for months. At the center of it all are money flows, energy deals, and a new set of economic policies coming from Canada that the Trump administration says threaten American interests. Officials close to the White House say President Trump believes Canada has been playing a dangerous game with its financial system, allowing transactions that could weaken U.S. leverage in global markets. And tonight, Trump decided to act. The order was signed quickly. The announcement came without warning. And within seconds, banks on both sides of the border began scrambling to understand what it meant. But the real shock was not just the decision. The real shock was what happened next, because Prime Minister Mark Carney did not ask for talks. He did not ask for patience. Instead, according to senior officials in Ottawa, he delivered a response so blunt that even members of his own cabinet were caught off guard. And now, the question everyone is asking tonight is simple. Did the United States just start an economic showdown with Canada? And if so, who will blink first? The moment the order became public, confusion spread through financial markets. Banks in Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal suddenly found themselves facing a new reality. Transactions connected to certain cross-border accounts were frozen, not slowed, not reviewed, frozen. Financial experts say the move is extremely rare between two countries that share the longest peaceful border in the world. For decades, the United States and Canada have operated almost like economic partners inside the same system. Trade flows back and forth every single day. Billions of dollars move across the border every week. Energy, technology, agriculture, banking. The two economies are deeply connected. But tonight, that relationship suddenly feels very different. Sources inside the U.S. Treasury say the decision was driven directly from the top. President Trump reportedly became increasingly frustrated with what his team described as financial loopholes being used in Canadian banking networks that could weaken U.S. sanctions and trade leverage. The administration believes some international players have been moving money through Canadian channels to avoid restrictions tied to American economic policy. And according to officials familiar with the discussions, Trump reached a breaking point. He ordered immediate action, not negotiations, not warnings, action. The goal, according to one senior official, was to send a message that the United States will not allow any financial system, even from a close ally, to undermine its economic power. But in Ottawa, the move landed like a thunderbolt. Canadian leaders were not expecting this. In fact, insiders say Prime Minister Mark Carney had been preparing for tough talks with Washington over trade and energy issues. But freezing bank accounts, that crossed the line few believed the United States would ever cross with Canada. And when Carney finally stepped forward to respond, something remarkable happened. Prime Minister Mark Carney's first words set the tone immediately. He said Canada would not be intimidated. That sentence alone sent shockwaves through political circles in Washington and Ottawa. According to people who were inside the room when Carney spoke to his advisors, several officials expected him to take a softer approach. After all, the United States is Canada's largest trading partner. Millions of Canadian jobs depend on trade with the U.S. Most leaders would move carefully in a moment like this. But Carney did the opposite. He warned that Canada would defend its financial system, and its economic independence. And then he said something that surprised even members of his own government. He suggested that Canada was prepared to consider countermeasures if the freeze was not reversed. That word countermeasures immediately raised alarms, because when leaders start talking about countermeasures, it means retaliation could be coming. Inside Washington, reactions were mixed. Some advisors close to President Trump reportedly welcomed Carney's strong response. They believe confrontation forces clarity in negotiations. But others inside the administration were less comfortable. They worried the dispute could spiral into something bigger, a full financial clash between two of the world's most stable economies. Markets reacted quickly. Investors began watching the situation closely. Currency traders started asking whether this could affect the Canadian dollar. Energy companies wondered if cross-border projects might suddenly face new risks. And ordinary citizens in both countries started asking the same question. How far could this go? Because while politicians often argue over trade rules and tariffs, freezing bank accounts moves the conflict into a much more serious territory. Financial power is one of the strongest tools governments have. Using it against an ally is almost unheard of. And tonight, the world is watching to see what happens. Inside the White House, officials say President Trump sees this moment very differently than many critics. From Trump's perspective, this is not an attack on Canada. It is a defense of American economic power. According to sources close to the administration, Trump has been increasingly concerned about how global financial systems are evolving. New alliances, new banking routes, new ways for countries and companies to move money without touching the U.S. system. For decades, the United States has held enormous influence over the world economy because the dollar sits at the center of global finance. But Trump believes that influence must be protected aggressively. And when his team presented intelligence, suggesting that certain international financial flows were being routed through Canadian channels, the president reportedly reacted quickly. One advisor described his thinking very simply. If a door is open that weakens American leverage, close it. Immediately, that thinking explains why the order came without warning. But critics say the move risks damaging one of the most stable partnerships in global politics. Canada and the United States share deep military ties, intelligence cooperation, and trade relationships built over generations. Disrupting that trust, some experts warn, could have long-term consequences. And now the situation has become even more complicated. Because behind the public statements and headlines, quiet conversations are happening right now between diplomats on both sides of the border. Officials are trying to understand exactly which accounts are affected, which transactions are blocked, and how far the freeze actually reaches. But here's the most important detail. The freeze does not just affect governments, even ordinary financial activity tied to cross-border transactions. And that means pressure is growing very quickly, and pressure on both leaders to find a way out of this escalating standoff. As the story spread across the world, reactions began pouring in from political leaders, economists, and financial institutions. Many were stunned, because disputes between allies usually happen behind closed doors. Quiet negotiations, the private warnings, careful diplomacy. But this crisis exploded into public view almost instantly, and the timing has raised even more questions. Some analysts believe the Trump administration may be sending a signal far beyond Canada, a signal to the rest of the world. The message could be simple. If financial systems anywhere are used in ways that weaken U.S. power, Washington will act, no matter who is involved. That interpretation is now being debated across global markets. But inside Canada, the focus is very different. Canadian leaders are asking whether their country is being unfairly targeted. Several members of Parliament have already demanded a full review of Canada's financial exposure to the United States. Some are even raising a bold question. Should Canada begin reducing its dependence on American financial systems? That idea was once considered almost unthinkable, but moments of crisis often push governments to reconsider old assumptions. Meanwhile, businesses on both sides of the border are watching nervously. Factories depend on cross-border payments. Energy companies rely on joint investment pipelines. Technology firms move money between offices in both countries every single day. And now all of that activity could face new uncertainty. But the most dramatic moment may still be coming. because sources in Ottawa say Prime Minister Mark Carney is preparing a second response, a response that could redefine Canada's position in this confrontation. And according to people close to the situation, what he may announce next could change the entire direction of this crisis. Tonight, the tension between Washington and Ottawa is entering a new and unpredictable phase. Behind closed doors in Canada's capital, Prime Minister Mark Carney has been meeting with senior advisors, financial regulators, and economic strategists. The discussions are intense, and the stakes could not be higher. Sources familiar with those meetings say Canadian officials are now studying a series of possible responses that go far beyond strong words. One option being examined is a financial counterstrike. That could mean restricting certain American financial operations inside Canada. U.S. banks operate widely across the Canadian economy, and limiting those activities would send a powerful signal back to apprised Washington. Another option being discussed is a rapid shift in Canada's international financial partnerships. For years, Canada has worked closely with the United States and other Western allies to maintain a shared financial system. But some Canadian policymakers are now asking the bold question: should Canada begin strengthening banking links with other global partners to reduce its reliance on American systems? Even raising that possibility would have been almost unthinkable just a few years ago. But crises change political thinking. And tonight, Canada's leadership appears determined to show that the country will not simply absorb economic pressure without a response. At the same time, Canadian officials are being careful. They understand that escalating too quickly could damage industries on both sides of the border. That is why Carney's team is carefully weighing every option. But one message is already becoming clear. Canada wants Washington to know that this dispute will not be settled by financial force alone. If the United States believed Canada would quietly accept the bank freeze, tonight's signals from Ottawa suggest the calculation may have been wrong. While leaders trade warnings and prepare strategies, another powerful force is entering the picture: the markets. Financial markets react quickly to uncertainty, and this situation has created exactly that. Traders, investors, and major financial institutions are now watching every signal coming from Washington and Ottawa. Currency markets were among the first to respond. The Canadian dollar experienced sudden pressure as investors began calculating the possible impact of financial restrictions between the two economies. Large investment firms are also examining potential ripple effects. If cross-border banking becomes unstable, it could affect corporate financing, international investments, and large infrastructure projects that depend on smooth financial cooperation. Energy companies are especially concerned. The United States and Canada share one of the largest energy trading relationships in the world. Pipelines, oil shipments, natural gas deals, and electricity flows all depend on steady financial systems. If payments become complicated or uncertain, those industries could feel immediate pressure. But the biggest fear among analysts is something even larger: a breakdown in trust. For decades, the US and Canada have operated under a simple assumption. No matter how tough political debates become, the financial system connecting both countries remains stable. Tonight, that assumption is under serious strain. If the freeze continues, companies may begin looking for alternative routes to move money, conduct trade, and manage investments. And once businesses stop building new systems, they rarely return to the old ones easily. That is why some economists believe the next few days could determine whether this situation remains a temporary dispute or evolves into something far more serious. Inside Washington, the debate is also growing. Not everyone in the American political system agrees on how far this confrontation should go. Some advisors close to President Trump strongly support the decision. They argue that protecting U.S. financial power requires bold action, even when it creates tension with allies. From their perspective, allowing loopholes or financial pathways that weaken American leverage would be a much greater risk in the long run. But other voices inside Washington are urging caution. Several lawmakers have quietly warned that escalating financial pressure on Canada could create consequences the United States may not fully control. Canada is not a distant competitor. It is a neighbor, a military partner, and one of America's most important trading allies. Billions of dollars in goods cross the border every single day. Factories in Michigan rely on parts from Ontario. Farmers in the Midwest sell massive amounts of crops to Canadian buyers. Technology companies operate offices on both sides of the border. A prolonged financial standoff could disrupt that entire ecosystem. That is why some members of Congress are already calling for urgent diplomatic talks. They believe the situation must be resolved quickly before it grows into a broader economic confrontation. But for now, President Trump appears determined to stand firm. And that means the pressure between the two governments continues to build. As the crisis deepens, attention is now turning to the next possible turning point: diplomacy. Behind the public statements and political messages, quiet communication channels between Washington and Ottawa are still open. Senior diplomats from both countries have reportedly begun urgent conversations aimed at preventing the situation from spiraling further. The goal is simple: find a path to de-escalation. But achieving that goal may not be easy. The Trump administration wants stronger assurances about financial transparency and control over international money flows connected to Canada's banking system. Canadian leaders, meanwhile, want the freeze lifted before they agree to any new conditions. Both sides are defending their national interests. Both sides are facing political pressure at home. And both leaders know that appearing weak could carry serious political consequences. That creates a delicate and dangerous balance. Because in moments like this, every word matters. Every decision matters. And every signal sent across the border could either calm the situation or push it closer to a full economic confrontation. Tonight, one thing is certain: a relationship that has long been considered one of the most stable alliances in the world is facing a sudden and dramatic test. President Donald Trump has made it clear that he is willing to use financial power to defend American economic influence. Prime Minister Mark Carney has made it equally clear that Canada will not back down under pressure. Two leaders, two powerful economies, and a confrontation that is now unfolding in real time. The coming days will be critical. Will Washington and Ottawa find a diplomatic solution before the situation escalates further? With financial pressure, false negotiations behind the scenes? Or could this dispute mark the beginning of a much deeper shift in the economic relationship between the United States and Canada? Those questions are now hanging over markets, governments, and millions of people whose livelihoods depend on the stability of the North American economy. For now, the world is watching closely, because what happens next between Washington and Ottawa could reshape the future of one of the most important partnerships on Earth. And tonight, the story is still unfolding.